Hello, and welcome to Imperialism in Republican Rome. In this video, we will discuss the many arguments surrounding the nature of Roman imperialism in the Mid-Republic, combining both primary source materials and modern scholarship to create a dynamic assessment of how Rome came to dominate the ancient Mediterranean. We will begin with the first original argument surrounding the nature of Roman imperialism, a view that was held by many Romans themselves, particularly figures such as Marcus Tullius Cicero and Titus Livius, to justify Rome's expansion and conquests. This is the thesis known as defensive imperialism, the idea that the Roman people, as Cicero put it, by defending her allies, had gained power over the whole world. This somewhat benevolent approach portrays Rome as a power not concerned with the building of empire, but with the security and integrity of the state. According to Erskine, any foreign threat perceived by Rome to itself or its allies prompted the Republic to vigorous preemptive action, the unintended result of which was increased power and territory for the Roman state. Scollard referred to defensive imperialism in his explanation of the causes of both the First Punic War and the Second Macedonian War. He argued that Rome accepted the appeal of the Mamertines and intervened in Sicily as they were concerned primarily for the safety of Italy. Likewise, the decision to fight Macedon in 200 BC, according to Scollard, was born out of fear of a devastating alliance between Philip V and the Seleucid king Antiochus III. This notion of Rome as a primarily defensive polity proved very popular among historians of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. The German scholar and Prussian politician Theodor Mommsen was the first modern historian to champion the idea, which would later be developed by the French and American historians Maurice Hollow and Tenny Frank. It is, however, important to remember the context of the times in which these individuals lived. It is no coincidence that classical scholars who lived during the era of European empires held particular fondness for Rome's empire and the acquisition of what Virgil referred to as imperium without end. Nations such as Britain and France, holding vast overseas territories, enabled a culture to develop which was rather sympathetic to Rome's expansionism. Hollow even went as far to describe the Romans as accidental imperialists. The theory of a so-called just war, known to the Romans as bellum justum, is an integral part of the defensive imperialism thesis. If we are to believe the late Republican accounts detailing the role and actions of the fetiales in early Rome, their function was to oversee the religious aspect of Rome's declaration of war. Only when formal demands for reparations had been refused by an adversary would the fetial priests declare before the gods that a state of war would ensue. The alleged Roman reluctance to annex conquered territory is another matter stressed by advocates of the defensive imperialism thesis. It is certainly true that in some cases Rome did not feel it necessary to expand her land when she might easily have done so. Examples of this attitude include the aftermath of the Second and Third Macedonian Wars, as well as the conflict with Antiochus. The argument, however, fails to explain Rome's actions in the annexation of Sicily and the Iberian Peninsula following the defeat of Carthage during the Punic Wars. As mentioned earlier, this argument was born in a time of European imperialism, and so must be approached with great caution. Although the thesis was generally accepted by Anglophone scholars for much of the 20th century, it became increasingly scrutinised towards the end of the 1970s. The social changes and distrust of large powers that had exploded in the previous decade no doubt influenced the post-colonial scholarly attitudes towards the nature of Roman expansion and imperialism. One of the first historians to challenge the notion of Rome as a defensive power was the British scholar Keith Hopkins. However, the most famous rebuttal of the thesis was made by Professor William Harris in his influential book War and Imperialism in Republican Rome. This remains the cornerstone of what is commonly accepted by most scholars today regarding Roman imperialism, although, as we shall see later, his arguments have not been universally accepted. Central to Harris's argument is the idea that Rome was primarily an aggressive predator state, far from the Ciceronian reluctant and defensive power that Mommsen and Hollow portrayed. Many of Rome's institutions, Harris argued, encouraged the Republic to actively seek out war for its own benefit. Examples of these include the network of treaties Rome held with the Socii, who provided a regular supply of manpower for her armies, in addition to the intense competition between the Roman aristocracy, seeking glory through conquest. When a regular supply of troops was combined with fresh annual consuls eager to lead armies for their own personal glory as well as to further the reputation of their family, the result was almost constant warfare. A year without war was always an opportunity lost for an incumbent consul, who competed not only with his peers but with the memory of his ancestors. Harris claimed that in the 100 years that preceded the Hannibalic War, the gates of Janus were closed only 5 times throughout that period, indicating the annual rhythm of Roman war. A predator state, of course, would have to rely on a militaristic society as its foundation, and Rome was certainly no pacifist society. The glorification of war is vividly illustrated in Polybius's depiction of a Roman aristocratic funeral, in which the achievements of the deceased was publicly honoured. Archaeological evidence also reinforces a Roman fondness of warfare, seen in the epitaphs of the tomb of the Scipios. There is also, of course, the common theme among many Roman consuls, whereby they would display their battle scars to the Comitia Centuriata as signs of their personal commitment to the res publica. Polybius's own view of how Rome came to rule the world in 53 years, as he put it, was not the sympathetic view held by Cicero or Livy. As a Greek outsider, he offered a far more aggressive picture of the Roman state, similar to Harris's own interpretation. Owing to Hannibal's defeat, the Romans, according to Polybius, feeling that their main step in their scheme of universal aggression had now been taken, were emboldened to reach out their hand and grasp the rest of Greece and Asia. Economic motivations regarding Roman expansion have always been a subject of controversy among historians. Although never seen as a crucial factor in Roman imperialism, Mommsen never dogmatically opposed all suggestions that there was an element of greed in Rome's wars. Frank, however, was strongly opposed to what he called mercantilist explanations of Roman imperialism, arguing that they owed too much to certain attempts to explain 19th century imperialism. Badian agrees with this interpretation, claiming that the myth of economic motivations in Rome's foreign policy is a mere figment of modern anachronism. There is no question, however, that huge tracts of land, as well as enormous quantities of gold and slaves, came into Roman hands following a successful war. Such an influx of wealth as a result of Rome's conquest and expansion had both civil and agrarian consequences for the Republic. Vast building projects, commissioned by wealthy aristocrats, were made possible through plunder, but the farmland of Italy became increasingly dominated by latifundia, controlled by a ruling elite, disenfranchising many local farmers who had served in the army. While Harris's revisionist approach to Roman imperialism has widely been accepted, several historians have added their own perspectives on the subject. Professor John Rich, for example, criticised Harris's lack of focus on the element that fear played in Roman foreign policy. The trauma that the Gallic sack of Rome had on the Roman people themselves should not be underestimated, nor should the danger that Pyrrhus of Epirus posed to the Republic. Perhaps most significant of all was Hannibal and the devastating defeats that he inflicted upon Rome. Out of this genuine fear, Rich argues that Rome became increasingly paranoid for its own safety, leading to an increasingly aggressive and imperialist policy. The most recent interpretation of Harris's argument, and perhaps the most significant to date, is the work of Arthur Eckstein in his Mediterranean Anarchy. In this, Eckstein argues that while Harris's hypothesis of Rome as an aggressive predatory state is correct, his worldview of antiquity is far too unipolar, and alludes to a sense of Roman militaristic exceptionalism. Many other ancient states, particularly in the Greek East, such as Athens during the Delian League and Antigonid Macedonia, were themselves highly militaristic and hawkish by nature. The core principle behind Eckstein's argument is the realist theory of interstate relations, a school of thought dating as far back to Thucydides and Polybius, Eckstein of course being an enthusiastic scholar for the latter. Realism dictates that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, essentially meaning that powerful states will inevitably dominate and conquer those less powerful or capable than themselves, without any sense of restraint. While Eckstein objects to Rome being the exception in regards to its militarism, He makes no hesitation in praising Roman exceptionalism in terms of its ability to assimilate outsiders and to create a large and stable territorial hegemony. He also points out that the power and legitimacy of many ancient states rested on the personal capabilities of the individual rulers, which, especially in the Greek East, consisted of monarchical dynasties. Rome here was again the exception, developing as it did not through the work of single titanic personalities, but through hundreds of annual executive magistrates. In a world absent of any codified international law, it was Rome's organisation and discipline that allowed it to sustain huge losses and major setbacks which no other polity in the ancient world could. Out of this, Eckstein argues that Rome became the ultimate predator state, enabling it to confront and defeat even the mighty realm of the Seleucids and the militarised warrior society of Macedonia. In an environment as harsh and anarchical as the one Eckstein portrays, it seems almost inevitable that Rome would use its considerable assets for its own imperial gain. In conclusion, although some of Rome's early conflicts can arguably be interpreted as a response to foreign aggression, the overall thesis of defensive imperialism is a rather romanticised view of the brutal nature of war and empire. Harris's rebuttal of the prevailing 19th century hypothesis, portraying Rome as an aggressive predatory state, is a far more convincing argument and a suitable explanation for Rome's rise to power, reinforced by Polybius's own experiences. Eckstein's revised view on Harris is an interesting perspective, and while it is true that Rome was certainly not exceptionally more aggressive than her neighbours, the notion of a realist anarchy appears somewhat out of place in classical antiquity. Thank you for watching this historical production. We hope you enjoyed the arguments made here, which, like many in historiography, are still ongoing debates. This has been Imperialism in Republican Rome, and we will see you on the next one.